record as much as I can as I'm driving to work. Starting my Facebook. I've got to go to work, but I'll record as much as I can on my way to work. This video is gonna be a rant. I just had the idea today because I'm doing this series and I have a general idea of what I want to do about part 4 when it comes to the relationship dynamic between African American, but I think there's a disconnect in what I've been recording, based on the simple fact that I'm trying not to use the terms white and black. So, and I also kind of go on a tangent about religion and Christianity and Jesus's role in the oppression of the African American male. So I want to speak concisely, if possible, on just what European and Caucasian should imply in this context of the relationship dynamic between the African American, right? So we all pretty much know what we should know. So there's two terms: patriarchy and monarchy. Patriarchy means ruled by men, and monarchy means ruled by, well, I think, yeah, basically ruled by, one means ruled by man, one means ruled by woman, right? So the household is the male, the female, and the offspring, right? That also just so happens to be the Trinity, right? The Trinity in Egyptian or most African cultures is the father, the mother, and the child, right? And then over the evolution, it becomes more concise, like the mother, the father, the son, or the mother, the father, the daughter, right? So when you get to Christianity, the Trinity becomes the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And this is all masculine energy. And the Holy Spirit is literally, without going into a whole lot of detail, the Holy Spirit is the feminine principle of the nature of the cycle of creation, birth, and rebirth, right? So the Holy Spirit kind of borrows the feminine energy. That's the reason why Jesus had to be born through Mary, but Mary had to be a virgin so that her earthly father is not a human being, right? But she also had to be married so that her conception of Christ isn't outside of wedlock, right? So this is the symbolism that we see in the Bible, and I need to specify that I'm not a Christian. I'm not a person that believes Christianity. I was just raised Christian, and I followed and I was taught Christianity as a child. And as I got older and I started getting into more philosophy and science, the symbolism was re-educated to me by my father, who started studying Egyptian yoga, as he called it, right? So from these principles, we come to a place where what gives society the right to govern each other? What gives Paul Emerson the right to tell you what you should do, right? What gives you the right to tell somebody else what they should do, right? If you think about the question critically, why is it okay for somebody to tell you what you can and cannot do? What gives humans the right to tell other human beings what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, right? In nature, all animals are free to live and survive, and so long as they are strong enough to protect themselves from each other, right? That is the law of nature. That is the morality of the natural order of the world. And then the ethics of that is higher creatures, like most higher mammals and higher animal life, embody the ethics of deciding to govern themselves based on their pain and their pleasure and the influence of their higher cognitive order, right? So from that, you get the ethics. This is what we should be doing because it feels good, and because it feels good, it's good. And this is what we should be doing because it feels bad and causes pain, so it should be considered bad, right? So from that, we get ethics. Humanity is so highly evolved that we have a capacity to define justifications of governance beyond what is natural in nature and beyond what is just pain and pleasure for the ethics, right? And from that we created law, and it is the universally application of law and order and rules and regulations and injustice and the ability for humans to have apathy for other creatures at a higher level of awareness and consciousness than other animals that gives us the justification for government. That is the true foundation of why humans govern. Because it makes sense for me not to punch you in the face as long as you agree not to punch me in the face. And if you punch me in the face, then I should be allowed to punch you in the face back, right? But then you get into the weeds with that, and it's just like, well, I'm going to punch you in the face because I know you're going to punch me in the face back. And it's like, yeah, but if you don't hit me first, then you won't have to hit me, then I don't have to hit you. And then if you don't have to hit me because I didn't hit you, that's kind of how this chaos begins, right? So in almost every culture, there is a condition of this idea of what we define as God. And I always state that when people ask me if I'm a Christian or if I'm an atheist, I say I'm neither. Good morning. I always state that it's because I accept the question more than the answer that I define myself as neither. There is a question that needs to be answered, and that to me is fundamental, right? Fundamentally, we all ask a question, and the answer to that question is God, right? So in all of this, because it's a lot of stuff that needs to be said in like 20 minutes, in all of this, we get to the four cultures of the planet: the islanders, the Africans. Hey, welcome to the stream. The islanders, the Africans, the Europeans, and the Asians, right? There's more subsections and subgroups of these four great races, but these are the four ethnic groups I'm going to use because it keeps everything concise. It makes it very easy to understand, and it definitely contradicts what has been established, right? For example, when I say Australian, you think of European, Caucasian. But if you do a Google search for Aborigines Australian, they're dark-skinned African people, right? So how do these dark-skinned people that look like they should be in the deserts of Africa wind up in the deserts of Australia? Why are they there? And why are they the original people? Why aren't the Africans the original people, right? So given these types of understandings and these questions, you realize something interesting. The Hindu Indians, the Native Americans were called Indian, but the Hindu Indians are also dark-skinned people. There has always been dark-skinned people all over the planet that were not defined as black. But why is there so many dark-skinned people all over the planet if we associate dark skin with Africans, right? There are two continents in the Western Hemisphere: North America and South America. The North Americans and the South Americans, before colonial Europeans came over to this side of the world with their guns and murdered and pillaged and plundered and colonized and destroyed, the indigenous inhabitants of the Americans were African people, right? They were African people. 300 or 400 years of interbreeding with Caucasians gave rise to the people we have here currently. The Native Americans, or the indigenous Americans that we have currently, the Spanish, the Latinos, and all of those cultures are the descendants of the Incans, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and all the other African historical cultures that we don't really talk about anymore. But those people were here before Europe got here. The relationship dynamic between the European Caucasian and the Caucasian American is one that is based on the foundation of the matriarchy and the patriarchy when it comes to the idea of kings and queens, right? And this is important, and that's why I went into the idea of Mary and the Trinity and all that other stuff. Because in Europe, the kings and the queens were revered as being superior and of the highest state of royalty because they had money, they had resources, and they have to govern the people. It is their responsibility to make sure that all of the resources and the wealth are distributed amongst the people, right? So you have the kings, which are the ones that have the nobility and the power and the largest armies, and then you have the nobility, who are not the kings, but they are the wealthiest of the kingdom that represent the kingdom and the nation and report directly to the king because they have all the resources and authority. The king regulates them, right? The king makes sure that the wealthiest and most powerful families in his kingdom do not overthrow his kingdom, because most of his wealth and most of his power for his family is typically used to govern the entire country instead of serving the needs and the individual desires of their family, right? That is the distinction, right? So the king and the queen, they do the things that the kings and queens do, and they live the lives that kings and queens live. And there's a very important thing that they tend to have done in Europe a lot. Hey, welcome to the stream. And that is interbreed with the peasants, right? The kings and the queens should only be mixing with the nobility because the nobility are the highest classes with the highest amount of money. But because they're human, they typically tended to go into the lower class parts of society and mix with the lower class members of society and wind up having children with the lower class members of society, right? So in Europe, this was going on for a long time. And then eventually they inherited the ideology. Well, I don't want to say ideology. They inherited the personification of the human condition as a deity. And when they learned this from the Africans, they said, this is an interesting way of governing yourself. You don't have to really use force or anything. You just tell people that the pharaoh, or you tell people that this particular African leader represents the right and the good of the people, and what he's choosing to do should benefit everyone. So if they all just do what he says, then right and good will come from it. So they took that principle and they wrote the Bible. And what they did was they said, in the monarchy, we are divine rulers by our blood. And we are divine rulers by our blood because we have the same blood of the gods that ordained us to be the rightful rulers of the planet. We have the right to rule because we are the divine blood of God directly, right? So this ties into the ideology of the personification of white Jesus, because Europeans associate themselves with God and they have a divine right because of God. And they themselves are of royal blood. Now, what we as non-Caucasians, non-Europeans don't understand is that they have established for themselves the idea that through their divinity, they are God, right? The same way that every human associates themselves with, through our divinity, through our bloodline as being the creations of God, we are all God's children, right? Because of the monarchy ideology, Caucasians define themselves as divine beings from God. And what they realized as a group of people on the planet was that if the kings and the queens, if your bloodline is what makes you divinity, and we know that throughout all of history, the kings and the queens that have always ruled have always mingled with and have had children with the peasants of the lower class peasants, then by definition, all of us are the same brothers and sisters, and we all have the same divine blood, because we know that the kings and the queens couldn't keep the bloodline pure. We know that they constantly would mingle with, lesser members of society and lower classes members of society. So we are all inherited of that blood. We are all inherited of the divine right to rule. So we should all recognize that we represent the divinity and the right to rule. So we should be the administrators of the entire planet and not just of the European regions. All Caucasians should recognize and defend and identify themselves as divine rulers. And they unified under that, right? When it came to America to do the things they were doing, they came here with that ideology, but they kept their individual nations, right? They came here as the 13 colonies. They kept their Europe, their Spain, their French, whatever the nations were. I gotta go back and check because I graduated high school in the year 2000, so I gotta go back and check. But this is what they ultimately defined themselves as. And when it came to America, and they were oppressed by the Europeans for the 300 years while they were doing the things that they were doing, we're not going into a tangent, they decided that they no longer wanted to be oppressed. They no longer wanted to be lower class members in a foreign land surrounded by foreign enemies under the guidance of a king that they have never met, right? So because of that, the disconnect from the physical place was easy to understand or disconnect from. The Caucasian Americans that were in America, or I should say the Caucasian Europeans, because they hadn't formed America yet, the Caucasian Europeans that were on North and South America at the time disconnected from the ideology of the European king and queen and the monarchy across the ocean because they never met those people. But the religion taught the Christ, right? It taught that the king has his rights and his rulership and his authority comes from Christ. And that is what gives him the right to govern these 13 colonies, because they all 13 colonies have the right from the same divine source, which is Christ, right? So the European Americans that were here realized that we could all unite under one unified ideology, and then we could form our own city-state and govern ourselves and become free men, right? So that was how they became free men of America in a foreign land illegally. And that's how they formed the Confederates in the Union. And then when they formed the Confederates in the Union, the division between the two ideologies of, are we going to have cheap paid labor, or are we going to have free unpaid labor? Those two ideologies of the North and the South, that disconnect is what gave rise to the Revolutionary War that united the southern continent of America from the northern continent of America. Because you would have had Canada, North America, South America, Mexico, the continent of South America. That's what the structure would have been. But when the South and the North came together, when the South and North came together and fought and they unified North and South America and freed slaves, they inherited the policies and the principles of slavery from Europe and had to address that issue when they formed the American people. But that's when they united under the ideology of white, right? And they never really truly unified under the ideology of white. They unified under the ideology of free men, and that was the most important part, because it was just free men, free European Caucasian men. Everybody else was not free. That's because the European colonies had already had structured it that way. This is a concentration camp, and we send you guys exports to produce goods and services cheaply, and then we export them back and we sell them in our society for cheap. You represent cheap labor. That was the whole point, right? So when this occurred, when they united under free men, and they still had to deal with the African slaves, they had to deal with the indigenous natives, and then they had to deal with the Canadians that were more unified, because they didn't have to deal with the chaos that came with dealing with the slavery and all that stuff. They united as the United States and defined themselves as white. They defined themselves as those people that have rights, who are white and are citizens, and everybody else. And they used that structure to establish how they would govern remember I told you the king and then the aristocrats and then the middle class and the low class. They use that structure to define the upper class of Americans. You have the government, whose responsibility it is to maintain order and governance and control the universally control all of the militaries and all of the power, and then directly under them are the elites, the 1%, those houses. So once the government said, well, we're only going to recognize free men as anyone that has actual citizenship, then the dominant force of people that actually were able to do anything in America at the time of its forming and its foundation were all European Caucasians that were transitioning into the idea of being an American. Hey, welcome to the stream. I gotta go on like 4 minutes. So that's pretty much the foundation of the dynamic between the Caucasian American and the European American. The European Caucasian versus the European American. I think we take it for granted. We spend a lot of time arguing about white, and we take it for granted that the biggest immigrants in this country are actually Caucasians. They are the biggest immigrants. And when it comes to the idea of the African American, I don't think that we should ignore or pretend like Africans didn't get brought to America. I think there's enough international history to show valid evidence and proof that the African transatlantic slave trade actually did occur, and that Africans were exported out of Africa to different parts of the world as cheap free labor, to a degree that even though we can identify with the land that we are on, it takes away from what happened to our ancestors to pretend like Europeans did not engage in that practice, right? So in that sense, it's not, even though it's easier to just accept the truth of the reality and then identify by your own self-defining value. I think that's the best way to approach it. Like we know that a lot of Europeans are bred with Africans. We know that there's not a single pure-blooded Caucasian American in America. But if they want to identify with themselves, if they want to identify themselves as Caucasian and European, they should have the right to do that. If they want to identify themselves as African, they should have a right to do that. The problem is that they're in a position to change the policies as they are, and they're the only ones in a position to change the policies as they are. And so they give non-Caucasians and non-Europeans the authority to write policies and laws that will allow us to have the proper representation that we also deserve. Then that's just, yeah, it's just going to be their burden to carry until they're willing to share the burden and give up some of the resources. That's just how it's going to have to be. So I need to go back to work. I need to get ready for work. It's going to be a long day. So as always, my name is Paul Emerson, and I've given you my 2 cents.